So thank you very much for coming. I think I would like to start by I started with this quote because I think it's an important one to understand the context of contemporary art. So what T.S. Eliot is doing in The Wasteland is he's pulling many quotes from disparate sources and pulling them together in a kind of wasteland. He's pulling from a kind of wasteland of culture. I think Heidegger, who is kind of known for being kind of very complicated, and he is, but primarily I think we can understand his idea of being, and he says that the metaphysical age, so from Plato to Nietzsche, fails to answer the question of being, and so he scraps it, and he likes the pre-Socratic, so he goes back there. And being for him is the same as, a good analogy is light in a room. So light in a room allows you to see objects in the room in the same way that being allows you to see beings in the room. And he signals the end of the metaphysical age, which has meaning structures and, for instance, religion. But all of these start to break down towards the end of the 19th century. For instance, Nietzsche's The Death of God. All of these metaphysical structures begin to break down. But before we get into kind of contemporary art, I'm just going to contextualize it so the apparatus of semiotic capture, which I borrow from Deleuze Guattari, which simply means is a kind of I guess it's a complicated phrase, but it basically means the apparatus of capture is really the state and how things exist within the state and how the state kind of keeps everyone in the state. So the apparatus of semiotic capture is how the ideas in art are organized. And from the Renaissance onwards, the apparatus of semiotic capture, which organizes semiotics, is the Cartesian phase space, which paints the Renaissance articulate through the linear perspective. And then Descartes comes along and actualizes in mathematics with the x, y, z coordinates. And here is an example of functioning metaphysical art. It has a very clear perspective and uses the Cartesian phase space. But towards the mid-19th century, this starts to break down with Edward Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Apologies. And this is what Jean Gebser would describe as an aperspectival image. So in the same way you are political or you're apolitical, you're consciously ignoring something. And he's consciously ignoring perspective, because if this was a perspectively correct image, the woman in the back would have to be a 9-foot tall giant. So he's collapsing the Cartesian phase space. Then we see with Cézanne, he begins to completely collapse perspective until you get he's now painting multiple perspectives. This is very much, I think, you can kind of compare it to the way Freud, at this point, he says, so Descartes said that the mind is the one knowable thing in the world. Freud says, well, actually, no, it's not the one knowable thing. And so you see this simultaneous kind of breakdown of the kind of one perspective in art with kind of Freud. But Cézanne wasn't aware of this. Marshall McLuhan said that artists act as an early distant warning system. So you can see that they're kind of very prescient of things that they're probably not aware of. And then in Cubism, you see the complete breakdown of perspective. But contemporary art, I don't mark it starting till Jackson Pollock, but I think everything in Marcel Duchamp is essentially present in contemporary art. And President Roosevelt said that of this painting, he said he could put up his rug and call it a painting, and the facts would align just as much as this painting does. So you can see that art is now entering essentially a theoretical phase space, where you have to think it works in the mind, but it doesn't necessarily work as a kind of art object. And this is one of his ready-mades. And Heidegger would say of this, I think, that it is so it's this idea that a Vorhandenheit is equivocal to a broken hammer. So a working hammer would be a Vorhandenheit. It would be readiness at hand. You could use it. And he's essentially drawing a kind of circle around the artwork and allowing it to enter essentially a theoretical phase space. So the Zuhandenheit is in the kind of life flow. So it's a working hammer. It's a usable tool. but then the forehand and height is now, something is broken, so now it becomes something to be thought about. In the same way, a broken hammer now enters a kind of theoretical phase space. And then I just want to articulate the kind of move to America, because that's really where contemporary art starts. And this I find quite funny. It's essentially it was about a kind of the question of the art object due to customs controls. So basically the customs officer was like, well, this isn't an art object. And Brancusi's sculpture, which is here, was held up as they didn't deem it an art object. Obviously, ultimately he won. And if you look at the phrase, this is not meaningless junk, well, actually a lot of contemporary art is meaningless junk, and that's the point. It's directly pulling from the kind of metaphysical wasteland that Heidegger had articulated. And this also, Duchamp said he packs up all his art into a kind of suitcase and then moves to America, signaling kind of the move to America. And this is Andre Malraux, who had the idea of the invisible gallery, the gallery without walls. So essentially he said, because photography allows you to pack up an entire gallery in your pocket, so this allows for the move to America. The move to America is very interesting because in 1776, Edward Gibbons published his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, simultaneous to the formation of America, and he essentially says that Rome is equivocal to America, whereas Britain is equivalent to East. He got this wrong, I think. Goethe, in Faust, he quite overtly compares kind of Germany and Italy to Greece, so a kind of high cultural phase, and Rome as the kind of very economically concerned civilizational phase, where the main concern is the kind of politics and economics rather than high culture. And I think this is the Colossus of Rhodes, and this is the Statue of Liberty, and both are kind of light bringers. There's this kind of interesting phenomenon where you always see a kind of light bringer towards the kind of civilizational phase. Sorry, I think I'm losing some people. So they're both kind of light bringers, but I'll move on to contemporary art now. So this is an early Pollock, and what you can see is that he's still functioning within the kind of form language of modern art. This is a kind of Jungian archetype. It refers to, interestingly, the archetype of the twins, because this is the she-wolf, which is the wolf that Romulus and Remus both suckle from. And the twins always signify a kind of world-building event, such as Cain and Abel. So you can see he's still functioning within modernism, but then he breaks this down quite quickly. And by 1950, essentially what he is loads of splashes on a canvas. Another interesting point is the orientation of Pollock's back has now gone back to an animal. He is kind of embodies a kind of shaman, and we'll see with Joseph Beuys that this is something that contemporary art is kind of concerned with. As you can see, he's bent over like in the same orientation as a animal. And Paul Virilio, very kind of presciently, I think, compared the way that Pollock paints on the ground, he's viewing his canvases on the ground, to the way that Sputnik travelled around the earth. It made the kind of earth the primary surface of inscripture for the artists to be working in. Post-modernity, I think this term is kind of quite confusing because essentially it suggests that it's building off of modernism, when really, in reality it's not. It's essentially liquefying it. And this is where I prefer Zygmunt Bauman's term liquid modernity, because it suggests the breaking down of meaning structures within art. And this is essentially white noise as a painting. And Deleuze and Guattari, in their book Difference in Repetition, essentially articulate how forms emerge from white noise. And indeed, if you kind of played Pollock's oeuvre in reverse, you'd see the forms arising, modernist forms arising out of this white noise. And I think there's a kind of want for forms to emerge, new forms to emerge out of this. And Karl-Heinz Stockhausen at this time was experimenting with white noise and how you could use electricity in music. And then I'd like to move on to talk about Mark Rothko. You can see, like Pollock, he's using very much modernist archetypes. This is very modern art. This is almost derivative of someone like Picasso or Miro. But then you see the same kind of melting down. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you obviously had the melting down of forms, and I think this is reflected in the artwork. He begins to melt down his forms. These are kind of primary units of light. These kind of organize into rectangles. He's very kind of, as McLuhan said, early distant warning system. He's very prescient of the electronics industry. In modern life, we're surrounded by kind of self-luminous rectangles that cover up the kind of surface of being. And he's very, very prescient of this, I think. And the kind of TV screens, and I think that's, but then in the later 50s, he introduces this element of blackening. And this, I think, relates to Heidegger's idea of the nothing, which inframes being. And you can see this slowly, it kind of polymerizes together to create a kind of inframing device of a kind of semiotic vacancy. He's working with semiotic vacancies here. And so a lack of image. He's melted down the images, so there's no image there. And you can see the nothing inframes it as a kind of object in and of itself, the semiotic vacancy that gives it a being. And this, I think this is a nice visual analysis. This is what Derrida terms a transcendental signified. So it refers to a kind of universal truth, a universal kind of spiritual truth. That was melted down in the post-metaphysical age. It's melted down. And I think it's a nice image because you have the same kind of inframing here as you did here, but now it's vacant. This reflects the kind of vacant heart of the West, I think. And then by the early 70s, you can see that he's essentially, the blackening principle has kind of dominated his artwork. He killed himself, I think a year before this was completed. And it's the complete victory of the nothing. And I think a nice comparison is Nietzsche, who entered a catatonic state. And when Rudolf Steiner, the German mystic, went to visit him, he said his spiritual body was kind of hovering over his physical body. And I think the same thing happens with Rothko. He seeks to separate the spiritual body from the physical body, as the physical body is in the realm of the nothing, in the physical world. And what's important now to recognize about Rothko is he essentially wiped the slate clean. It's a very nice phrase for what we see with pop art. So pop art now articulates the icons of the postmodernity and the icons of the post-metaphysical world. So Rothko's wiped the slate clean, and this is one of the icons of the metaphysical age. And you can see Andy Warhol, who kind of epitomizes what pop art is doing. He now plugs Marilyn Monroe's face into that same kind of gold with the gold background. He makes it essentially the icon of the 20th century. But in Einsteinian special relativity, when you speed an object up into the speed of light, it goes through a flattening process. And I think the same thing is happening here. I think these are 2D icons. There's not much material behind them. The doubling in the diptych refers to the doubling of the self, the mediatized persona. It essentially creates a disparity in the psyche, I think, and as a kind of electric doppelganger. And then what we see with the Elvis ones, what I'd note about this is he uses red here to refer to, I think, the cult of Dionysus. When Rome is falling, Rome is falling, you see the cult of Dionysus, which is essentially a kind of sex cult for a kind of imagined Bacchus, who was the kind of god of wine. And I think the same thing happens with rock and roll in America, which is kind of, I think it's quite interesting. But the doubling here refers to the silver screen and the colored screen, as it does with Marilyn Monroe. The doubling of Elvis here, I think, might refer to the fact that he had a twin brother who died, and then he would speak to it. He would say, like, backstage, "Jesse, are you listening?" Which is quite a kind of haunting idea, I think. Then with the Brillo box, Arthur Danto marked when Warhol brought the Brillo box into the museum or into the gallery, he signaled the death of art. The kind of difference between the object and the art object had been completely disclosed, and you can see this is a kind of, he's conferred a kind of fetishistic quality on the Brillo box, which is essentially what we see in advertising. So you can see the kind of, it's very prescient of kind of the way capitalism kind of capitalist signifies. The other thing that I would mention about Andy Warhol is obviously fame. In the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. In 2010, YouTube limited the video length to just 15 minutes in reference to this, and I think he would have been very interested by something like YouTube. He made these kind of hour-long films just videoing people doing nothing, and I think with TikTok or something, you see people videoing themselves, and nothing transpires apart from the act of fame itself. And I think he's very aware of this. This is 12 Most Wanted Men, and almost kind of, I think he enjoyed this. He then had to cover it over because of concerns over possible racism, because they're all Italian, or xenophobia because they're all Italian men. And I think he liked this. He liked the kind of flashing forward of fame and then removal of it. And then, of course, the repetition of the image is really something that media is very concerned with. And the hyperreal, what Baudrillard terms the hyperreal, where the copy of an object is prioritized over the actual thing. And the repetition of the image, it basically inscribes it into a kind of cultural memory. And we see this with 9/11. The repetition of the image basically made it a kind of monument in of itself. And Rauschenberg is another great pop artist. He's more so than Warhol, pulling things from the kind of metaphysical junkyard and suturing them together. And also he's very prescient, less so of the kind of fetishistic quality that advertising takes on, and more so the kind of semiotic overloads. The Buffalo number 2, this is a semiotic overload. There is so much going on that nothing has to be a kind of good image for it to kind of work as an image, so you get overcome by the pure quantity of the images. When I was in Times Square, I think it was quite interesting to see how Rauschenberg reflected the kind of overstimulation within Times Square. And then I'd like to just discuss a later pop artist, Basquiat, and this is Holderlin, who's one of my favourite poets, and he says, I'm what a poet's for in destitute times. And with Basquiat, we see the artist is now ontologically on the outside of the city. He's now painting on the city walls. He's now been excluded. He's now an outsider, basically. Ovid, in 8 AD, is expelled from Rome by Augustus, and because the artists now have a kind of dangerously superfluous relationship to the city as a kind of apparatus that symbolizes the culture that they're in. And you can see the artist is fighting, in the kind of black figure in the self-portrait. He's now fighting, he's kind of erasing the semiotic overload. And he goes through a kind of experiment, I think, in his art. He tries to encapsulate all the semiotics of the city, such, the advertising, graffiti, all of that into his head. And this doesn't work. And you see on the other self-portrait on the, which one? on the right, you can see that the artist is now kind of exploded. There's body parts kind of here and there, so it doesn't work. The kind of a semiotic overload overcomes him. And then Paul Thek, he's kind of a less. We have spoken about a very popular artist, but he's a lesser-known artist, and he essentially is very much more spiritually concerned than any of the other ones. He says, after visiting the Sicilian catacombs, he says, well, I could decorate I could decorate a room with body parts. And this, I think, refers to the myth of Osiris, where the body of Osiris is torn up so as to kind of, and in contemporary art, we'll see that there's an attempt to kind of suture together these body parts. He gives the Brillo box a kind of 3D interior so as to kind of give it a spiritual connotation. But you can see inside it's kind of gross, what he termed a meat piece, which is kind of gross. And here you can see the body parts. These refer to kind of the Homeric kind of heroes of the kind of metaphysical age. And then in the these would come together to make a whole person in the metaphysical age. The sketches of Michelangelo, they're essentially dislocated body parts that would then come together to make a whole. But in the post-metaphysical age, they are just separate things. Until he attempts to kind of suture them together to make a whole. This is called Fishman, and it's quite a weird sculpture, I think. But it refers to, I think, Christ as the great fish god, the one who kind of pulls people from the waters of ignorance. It also, I think, might refer to the Osiris myth, where one of his pieces is thrown into the ocean and then creates a kind of whale, or the myth of Zeus being torn up and one of his bits becoming Venus. I think he's playing around with that kind of semiotic here. So you can see he's trying to suture together. But I wanted to put this image in to emphasize the flatness of the American landscape. America is, as Rothko said, a clean slate for kind of new semiotics to be applied, the semiotics of Warhol, which, the capitalist connotations. But in Europe, it's a very different story. The landscape is essentially of ruins. And we see with Joseph Beuys in a minute that he's essentially pulling dysfunctional, broken forms into his art. This is Queen Bee. This is in his first kind of period where there are forms, functional forms, and this refers to, I think, Rudolf Steiner's idea that the hexagonal lattices that bees form in the honeycomb is analogous to the way the red blood cells form hexagonal lattices within the bones. So there's a kind of world-building connotation here. He was very influenced by Rudolf Steiner. But if we move into then this piece, Mountain King, you can see that essentially beings are becoming absent within his art. It refers to a passage in Finnegan's Wake. His clay feet swarded in verdigris stick up stark where he last forlorn. And it's essentially a disassembling of the person in the age. These are kind of the waste of the metaphysical age. And in the Auschwitz vitrine, you see a similar idea. This is the traces of humanity. There is a lacking in the kind of protagonist figure. And then with this piece, he kind of evolves this cosmology and has the kind of, and I think he is dialoguing with Van Gogh here. The chair is welded within a kind of metaphysical functioning world. It refers to the kind of French peasantry. It's in that kind of world. But he now de-worlds it, which is one of my favorite terms that Heidegger uses. He de-worlds the chair and doesn't imply any context around it. It's now a kind of homeless object. The fat for him has a kind of, he likes it for its receptivity to form. And I think he's covered over the right angularity of the chair, which he sees as overly masculine. He wants to undo that, which it was associated with the Industrial Revolution, where essentially overly masculine principles are prioritized over the feminine ones. And then this is one of his performances where he held a dead rabbit and kind of whispered interpretations of his art. And you can see the kind of Albrecht Dürer's young hair. It's alive and happy and in a kind of world, but it's now been de-worlded and it's dead. And he's trying to repair the kind of bonds between the animal and the human. And then in the pack here, I think what comes to mind to me is the kind of sled being led on by kind of wolves. But now that the wolves are absent, there's no humans as well. He essentially made these care packages for what Heidegger would term the ontologically homeless human being. And he constructs a kind of myth at the kind of start of his career, where he says that when he was a Nazi pilot and he got shot down, he was rescued by some Tatars who wrapped him in felt and wrapped him in fat. And these essentially have they represent the warming principle in his art. But now for the post-metaphysical age, they're warm, but they also have an isolating principle. here, and you can see the isolating principle here. This is now an unusable object. He's the object that makes sound. He's wrapped it in felt, which of course will absorb sound. And the cross in his art always signifies an emergency. And then in one of his last pieces, this is the complete victory of what Rudolf Steiner would call the stiffening or mineralogical principle, which is essentially what the body is working against in anthroposophical science. So the kind of spiritual quality is always fighting against, like, for instance, in age, you have a kind of stiffening up of the body. And you can see the complete victory of the stiffening. It's quite a pessimistic work, I think. Then I'd like to move on to Odne Nordrum, who I think is quite interesting. He was also very influenced by Rudolf Steiner and was taught by Joseph Beuys. But you can see a very different, what he does, which I think a lot of people exclude him from the conversation of contemporary art. But I think what people fail to realize is that actually a retrieval of the style of the old masters, of the kind of Cartesian phase space, is itself a kind of constitutive factor of contemporary art. He terms it retrieving the kind of kitsch of the old masters. He celebrates kitsch as a kind of warming idea, and I think that's quite an interesting thing to say. But he creates myths that essentially have no. He refers to myths that the viewer is unaware of, and they lack what Heiner Mühlmann would call a maximal stress cooperation event, which, for instance, in Christian theology, that was the crucifixion of Christ. So everything referred back to the crucifixion of Christ. But now there is none, and you have to supply the kind of missing myths to his art. And I think it's this essentially is he paints a post-literate wasteland. And Nietzsche says that kind of pain is the greatest mnemotechnic device. And indeed here, I think he's using pain. And in Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, they say that in a post-literate society, the body becomes the primary surface of scripture. So he's essentially painting a very post-apocalyptic world. And it's as if he was an alchemist playing with some homunculus inside a kind of a bit of apparatus, and the curvature of the landscape is very interesting to me, and if you trace it through his work, you can see that it essentially pushes the humans off into a kind of semiotic vacancy. So I think he fails to create a kind of imaginary world because they're expelled into kind of the same semiotic vacancy that Rothko was working with. And now I think I'd like to move into a discussion of the works of Gerhard Richter. And this is often the first kind of piece in his oeuvre, and I think it's very interesting because essentially what you have is he's now effacing the pop art. Before it was just a pop art painting of a kind of table, but he's now effaced it. And if we look at Heidegger's essay on the question of being, he effaces being, literally effaces it, so as to kind of remove its kind of metaphysical connotations. And what we'll see in the art of Gerhard Richter is he's now effacing photographs so as to remove their metaphysical connotations. But what is also interesting is using secondary source photographs. Wilhelm Fluss said that there is no simple, naive recording of reality with a photograph. Purely because what you have with a camera is it's recording a chemical formula of reality. It's not recording reality. And so this image is now 3 times removed from reality. It goes through the eye, and then it goes through his paint that he's kind of swiped over with his vermelling process, and then it goes through the camera's lens. So it's twice removed from reality. And this, I think, is an interesting work. He essentially did 48 portraits of kind of great men of the West. But they're all kind of ambiguous now. He essentially just scraps them all and makes them kind of fuzzy and hazy, and there's now a distance between them because they are part of a kind of world age. And the other kind of plane of signification that he's working in is a very kind of abstract plane. He's now wiping it, he's now using the same kind of action, he's wiping it, but these are now the scars of being. He's now effaced being completely, and now these are the kind of scars of the paint that he's now swiped across. And I think this is just really quite exceptional abstract painting. And then I'd like to now move on to kind of a discussion of Anselm Kiefer. And if anyone kind of epitomizes the contemporary artist who is now the fisherman of forms out of the kind of metaphysical age. Well, and what we'll see with Kiefer is he now introduces the pre-metaphysical age, so prior to kind of Plato, so all the myths of the kind of very ancient, far off. He's interested in Kabbalah and stuff, but in this work he refers to Post-metaphysical poem Death Fugue, in which he contrasts the figures of Margareta, who has golden hair, with Shulamit, the Jewish woman who has grey hair. And I think the straw here refers to possibly Rumpelstiltskin, and how he turned straw into gold. And also it kind of refers to a menorah, which I think is quite interesting. And you can see he's essentially arguing that the German and Jewish side of Germany was essentially inextricable from each other. This essentially refers to the myth of the master craftsman. Volland is essentially the German version of Daedalus, but it's obviously much darker because it's German. So he tears up the king's children and makes wings and kind of a bowl out of them. And so it's much darker. But here the book. He refers to the book as a kind of metaphysical artifact by making it lead. It's now unusable in the same way that Joseph Beuys was essentially making unusable forms. But it could refer to Milton's section in Paradise Lost, with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sats brooding on the vast abyss. The Galileo and Newton were both said to kind of be reading from nature's book. But now that's a very metaphysical idea. He dumps it into kind of a metaphysical scrap heap. And Isis and Osiris, you can see that he's put a kind of coding board, and the wires are coming off it. It refers to, again, the kind of myth of Osiris being torn up. But you can see that it's now becoming all connected by a circuit board. And I think he's very prescient of the idea that the gods are being recoded in a kind of digital way. And then this is one of his sculptures, Melancholia, and it's a plane made out of lead, which is kind of obviously completely unusable object because lead is the heaviest metal. But in alchemy, it can be transformed into gold through, and I think this is. He used Durus Solid, which some people interpret to be the philosopher's stone, and I think he's interested in the kind of transformative qualities of art. He essentially makes a scrap heap of the library as a kind of metaphysical artifact again. But this is his La Ribot, which he essentially puts all his work into, and it's essentially a desolate wasteland. And this, I think, is quite interesting because the scrap heap motif is throughout history. It's kind of a reoccurring idea. So in the Renaissance, Michelangelo made essentially a scrap heap of antiquity and the Renaissance entirety. The Greek monks were chased out of Greece by the Ottoman Turks, and they were carrying scrolls of the great works that would influence the Renaissance, like Plato and also like the Corpus Hermeticum. And this is the lacune is uncovered in 1506, and you can see the influence it would have on the Renaissance sculpture. And now in Italy, this is Arte Povera, which and Yannis Kounas is kind of the great figurehead of it, and he puts 12 horses into a museum, and these are essentially de-worlded beings. He kind of embodies in his art the kind of farmer in the city, so he's now de-worlded within the city. And I think you can make a comparison here to the way that the Paleolithic artists were painting like animals on the inside of the cave, so as to open up a portal into another world. And I think he's opening up the world of the French peasantry into the gallery space. These are de-worlded. That's the main thing with him. And this is from the metaphysical age. So it's the huge, gigantic human that we see degraded down in this piece called Civil Tragedy. He was very influenced by Kafka, and I think this essentially refers to the way that the human being has been degraded down to a mouse navigating a maze of bureaucracy. And he sets it against the gold to refer to this. And this, again, he's saying that the viewer now must supply the missing world, and the missing world horizon, and he uses the kind of amphory to refer to the Greek burial system that has now been surrounded by bags of coal. Bags of coal always refer to kind of industrialization in his art. And I think there's an interesting point that Stephen Bann makes, which he says that the weight in his art, there's always a kind of weight to Yanis Knesset's art, and it kind of refers to the body of Christ. So the body of Christ is essentially the driving force for Western physics, and metaphorically speaking. And as you can see, this is kind of post-Newton and Galileo, who had their theory of falling bodies. So Rembrandt is influenced by this, and now Christ's body is now very heavy. And you can see by the time of his art, he is now is essentially Christ has fallen off the cross completely, and has been kind of is missing entirely, and is now replaced by bags of coal or the kind of artifacts of a de-worlded world that is the kind of world of the trade that the Persian rugs refer to. And now I'd like to move on to discuss the works of Christian Boltanski, and he essentially in this piece refers to the piles of clothes that were built up during the Holocaust, and essentially the sorting process. He's very concerned by the sorting process. His major concern is the kind of dead and our relationship to the dead. And so this is kind of signals Foucault's biopolitical age, where beings are kind of sorted out by the state, whereas before they were sorted out by God, the hands of God. You can see here that the claw here, I think, does refer to the hand of God, now moving and dividing up the humans. And then the other aspect of his art is the kind of archive. This is the Book of the Dead, and you can see the god Thoth is recording the dead, and I think he's doing a similar thing. In Franz Bockenau's Cycle of the Dead, he says that there's a kind of pendulum swing from the civilizations that embrace the dead and are essentially death accepting, and then ones who are essentially death transcending. And so the Egyptians are death transcending in that because they built up their entire civilization around kind of mummification and the cult of the dead, whereas the Greeks and the Hebrews are much more concerned by they kind of ignore the dead. Ultimately, the Hebrews essentially just shove the dead in a cave, and Abraham in the Old Testament buys his cave to be for his burial. So you can see they package away the dead. But the West is now essentially a death-denying culture. This is what Franz Bockenau says. And you can see his concern here. He's essentially creating an archive of the dead. And here he retrieves Plato's cave. Plato said that, people ignore pure rational enlightenment because they're seeing shadows on a cave wall. And he retrieves this so as to implant us back into the kind of world of becoming that Plato makes a scrap heap of. And then I think I'd like to discuss a little bit about Cy Twombly. And this is the Palmer method, and you can see he's in this piece, he's almost parodying it. He's pastiching the kind of the kind of writing systems of the contemporary world. And I think he's also articulating the breakdown of language. In the post-metaphysical world, language begins to break down, such as the sentence, "You are beautiful." The beautiful here is supposedly an adjective, but because it presupposes a kind of neutral sense of being in the post-metaphysical world, it's not grammatically correct to say that. You need to say, "You are being beautiful," which would make beautiful a kind of adverb. So it's kind of interesting, the kind of breakdown of language that occurs in the post-metaphysical age, which I think he's articulating. And then the YBAs, I'm not a fan of them. They essentially epitomize the kind of making fun of meaning. They're not engaging with kind of meaning processes. And in the Hellenistic, you see the same kind of thing occur. This essentially ignores meaning and makes a kind of mockery of it, these kind of late Hellenistic sculptures. Damien Hirst is the great exception. Everything is very modular in his art, and these are kind of semiotic placeholders, he said, to his art. Then in the medicine cabinet, this refers to, when it's almost like you see gravitational wobbles around stars refer to invisible planets in science, and this essentially is quite similar because you see the kind of a medicine cabinet which implies sick, diseased bodies that revolve around it. And so everything is very modular. He is very concerned that everything becomes modular, and just as kind of you can kind of take apart parts of the human body, and kind of he's very concerned by that. And then I want to quickly move on to a discussion of land art, which Walter de Maria has made his Earth Room, which if you went to New York we visited, and I think a lot of people said, what the flip? But it's like, it's almost like the Earth is now invading the museum space. And this is quite a monumental work, because now the art is now spilling over into the gallery, and it's not conforming. It's essentially pushing out of the gallery space. And what we see with Robert Smith and Spiral Jetty is he epitomizes this. Essentially, he's now constructed a structure that fits into the land. He's now inscribing on the land, and you can see the influence of Pollock on this. The earth is now the primary surface of inscripture for the artist. And Michael Heiser's City, now he's made a kind of makeshift apparatus of semiotic capture for the loose semiotics of contemporary art. Peter Sloterdijk, in his big books called Spheres, he says that essentially from the church, which acted as a kind of globe that encompassed everything, and then you have the kind of middle class patrons of the kind of Baroque, start in the Baroque era and the Renaissance. They essentially create bubbles, and then by modernity you essentially have foam. So everything exists. Everything exists in foam. So everyone is in their own kind of separate bubble, and there's lots of things going on. But he essentially creates an apparatus to contain this all. And then I'd like to, James Turrell's Rodin Crater, I just think is wonderful. He retrieves the kind of Christian macrosphere, the kind of womb-like thing, and you can see here he kind of resists the horizon line, so as to kind of create a kind of dome over the viewer. And you can see the kind of womb-like connotations of it from seen from space. He retrieves the matriarch, the kind of the Mother Earth idea, which was dispensed by the kind of Hebrews and the Romans. They, for instance, the Eve is born out of the side of Adam. That's a kind of makeshift, like vagina on a man, and then Zeus's head is kind of popped open to birth Athena. And you can see he kind of undoes, he kind of tries to undo that. He now he kind of wants a kind of conception to take place where the father sky impregnates Earth so as to kind of breed new signifiers. And you see Native American ideas pop up. This is essentially, Native Americans had this idea that you were people coming up from the underworld through the kind of amniotic fluid and climbing up through a ladder. And he's retrieved this idea in his artwork. But I'd like to now, this is the last artist I'll talk about. And you can see, and with Turrell, he was imposing a kind of geometry on the world. And it's not a slight against him, I love his work, but this is Plato and then Aristotle. And you can see that Plato sees the Platonic forms as in the heavens, that then can be brought, that then the real world kind of, the viewed world, basically. He sees this as covering up the Platonic forms. But then Aristotle, he sees these kind of forms, these geometric forms, as immanent within nature. And so when you look at the work of Andy Goldsworthy, it's an interesting comparison, because he's essentially working with the geometries of the world. And I mean, these are quite beautiful works, I think. He spent 3 days putting together these feathers to form a kind of natural geometry. He doesn't impose any kind of what he describes as the cliche of geometry. And it took him 3 days. But there's also, importantly, an ephemerality to his work. The feathers could be blown away. All that remains is the photograph of them. And this again, he puts leaves in a kind of this aesthetically beautiful way. I think Goethe would have really appreciated his work. And there's a concern for kind of, whereas Turrell was concerned with creating the monuments for the West, or the metaphysical age entirely by creating these kind of huge stone monuments. He's now creating kind of very ephemeral works, apart from these kind of what he calls cairns, but they are essentially, I think they look like eggs, and they are essentially permanent eggs, and these kind of represent a kind of want for new forms that hatch out of them. And and I think in Finnegan's Wake, this is kind of made apparent. The kind of he uses the name Tristan, which refers to kind of tree and stone as the two opposing ideas. And you can see he's kind of stone being kind of permanent and the tree being kind of impermanence. And this is still, and this will one day kind of melt and topple over, but it's still quite an amazing artwork. And I wanted to conclude with this image, which is essentially essentially we uncovered the Rome and the kind of detritus of Rome, and indeed one day I think people will uncover the detritus of the West. However, we are great preservers. The Romans had no conception of history. All their historians essentially were writing about things that happened a couple of years ago. They had no conception of history, but we're very concerned with preserving stuff. And so it's important for the artists like Turrell and like Andy Goldsworthy to now articulate this kind of burial of art. And I think that concludes what I'd have to say about that. So thank you very much.
That was amazing. I wanted to ask where you feel like your work fits within. Like, because you mentioned so many really cool concepts, like the de-worlding, which I thought was really interesting, but also I think kind of like the impermanence of work, but also things like the melting down of sort of things into just like the forms and lines. Like how, if it does at all, I'm assuming some of it has influenced your work in some ways. But might not have. But like, how does your work?
I mean, what I've done kind of unconsciously is kind of work through the history of kind of contemporary art. In my GCSEs, I was the exam period. I was very concerned with pop art, and then I began to move into kind of surrealism and kind of making kind of boxes that you look through. And then now I like kind of Tifa and voice, so I'm very interested in them. So I'm kind of working through a kind of the form languages to get to a kind of new form language, and I hope to be kind of, I really want to make land art, but that's quite hard, because you just buy the land.
Earlier we talked about like, what the name of the artist, but when he was going to impact of Wood's art, took photos of it, put it in like studios, also was around. Would you say that if maybe give it 50 or 100 years, if the world, the West itself was to collapse, the art which we have now was to collapse? If the new world was to go off that, would you say that the art would still have the same effect if preserved through a photo as opposed to preserved through like detritus like this?
Not at all. It would not be preserved in any way. Indeed, our view of kind of classical art is very skewed. We have to kind of translate Virgil, for instance. So there's a kind of disconnect there. I hope that kind of answers your questions.
So you mentioned like preservation of art, particularly in the future. In terms of like considering how art is becoming increasingly digital, and a lot of institutions are prioritizing digitalizing old art, old documents, and making sure that new art is also preserved digitally. in the instance, like, do you think that digitalizing art is trying to create permanency, or is it trying to deal with, to prolong how long it stays? Because, like, we know that it's ephemeral.
Okay, so basically, I didn't mention this because I didn't want to over kind of crowd you with ideas, but one of the major things that has kind of informed this is Oswald Spengler, and this might not answer your question slightly, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. And on the surface it's quite a kind of gloomy work, but essentially what he argues is that civilizations and cultures have a kind of, they're essentially all organisms within themselves, and so go through a kind of birth and a kind of high cultural phase, which for us was the Renaissance and the Baroque, and then it starts to decay into a kind of civilization. And we're quite analogous to, it's quite helpful to think about Greece and Rome for that. But what I want to say to that is that we have a kind of, what he describes as a Faustian ideal. There's always a destiny ideal for these kind of cultures, and ours is Faustian, and he refers to Goethe's story, Goethe's novel, or play, it's kind of both, and which is essentially a constant striving for constant progression, constant kind of technological advancement, and you see that we're going to essentially, you're going to drive everyone into the ground with that kind of, and the climate change is essentially going to kill everyone or kill a lot of people in like 100 years. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, and he's so like on it with America. He says that, and this was 1914. He says that essentially it will be run by technocrats, and you can see that happen. I don't bother to read the news. I just read Oswald Spengler. You can see, everything that is happening. You can he says in kind of way. Yes.
Alright. So with a lot of these like more postmodern, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's like very abstract and like sometimes it's like a bit hard to like get the initial understanding just from the first view. Do you think that in the future, if these images and art pieces are preserved, that they'll be looked on with different like views to what we're looking at now because of the cultural or what societal views that everyone's in? Because I imagine that the way we view them right now are kind of to do with the way our society is, if that makes sense. Like, so will their meanings change over time as we change?
Well, the art object kind of slips into a non-art space. It as soon as it kind of becomes a de-worlded signifier, which essentially happens to classical art, as with their antithesis, but still pretty and so we view it as kind of, we view it in a very archaeological sense. We're uncovering kind of the psychological motives of the ancient world. So it won't be appreciated as an art object in the same way that we can appreciate this as an art. So there is a kind of ephemerality to all the kind of contemporary art. And post-modern art kind of always resists meaning. That's the point, it's kind of resisting the
What impact do you think AI will have on contemporary?
AI, I think, so to understand AI, I personally see its impact on knowledge being the most crucial one to kind of understand. So its impact on art will not be huge, but its impact, because essentially you see land art, you can't replicate that with AI. And you never will be, because essentially even if you are using essentially a human semiotic, it's applied on that, I don't know what's going on there. So its impact on knowledge is what interests me. You essentially have the condensation of knowledge from the ancient world, where you had essentially a whole building that was surrounding one text on stone tablets. You essentially have that condensed down to the library, where now books are now categorized. They're essentially a small library within themselves to an ancient person. But now you have that collated, condensed further into AI, where everything is accessible. And Baudrillard in the 90s he had 3 articles on the Gulf War, and he basically said the Gulf War did not take place. And indeed, the Gulf War kind of didn't take place in the way that anyone understood it at the time, because essentially there was an overcrowding of information about it, and no one knew what was going on. So I think AI will have that kind of effect. Essentially, it will erase knowledge in the same way that the kind of deconstruction of metaphysical ideas will break down language. It will also break down knowledge, and it will have to rethink knowledge. So I think that would be the impact. Martha?
With the cult of Dionysus and the Fall of Rome, like, you
I think, well, I think T.S. Eliot said in a poem, the world will not end in a kind of loud crash, it will end in a whimper. And as Rome kind of ended in a whimper, it kind of slowly succumbed to Christianity. And I think the West will slowly succumb to, slowly succumb to something else. I think that's kind of, yeah. So, I mean,
at what point, if any, do you think that artistic analysis like this, whether it be someone who was more or us doing Renaissance art, people from Renaissance doing art, and at what point does that lose its need? Because if, I don't know if this is what you argue, but if viewing a piece of art not necessarily as primary observer, i.e. seeing the photo, doesn't encapsulate the full meaning, at what point does you, or someone else analysing it, have any use?
well, I think photography is interesting because it does kind of, certainly contemporary art, because it works in a theoretical way, it does preserve something of the art object within the photograph. You can experience the contemporary art in a photograph. So you see the kind of, in the civilization of things, you see the kind of breaking down of the meaning signified, which you see in kind of postmodern art. And so you do, even in the same kind of cultural phase, you see the kind of same with civilization, you see the kind of breakdown of meaning structures, and so you kind of have that kind of you essentially begin to misunderstand the art and can't engage with it. And I suppose I think that might probably ask you later. Luke?
Do you think that modern contemporary art lacks the capability to create a political change?
Oh, no, I think that's a very naive view. Art essentially was, think of Napoleon's portraits. They're kind of very imposing, and they essentially were used to kind of demonstrate this power. Essentially, art used to be politics. Think of the Medici family. But now it's slowly become more and more superfluous. And so no, I don't think it has any political power. I think it can have a kind of impact on your view of politics, if that's what you mean, but it can't change anything. I don't think
Yeah. What are your thoughts, feelings, and emotions about the way that a lot of contemporary artists, and I guess also a lot of old artists as well, but they do things that I think are quite unethical in the name of art, particularly things like animals, but also I don't know, didn't you guys kill a shark or something? And things like the horses in that room, how are they treated, and then things like the room full of earth I have problems with as well because of housing crisis, using a full apartment to just fill it with that, stuff like that. What do you think about the ethical side of doing things in the name of art and kind of calling it, saying it's okay because, well, it's an art piece? You know?
Well, without kind of opening up a kind of discussion on kind of Nietzsche's kind of destruction of moral values, I would just simply say that I think if you're placing all your concern in kind of contemporary art and the ethics of contemporary art, I would kind of question why? Because there are so many. There are thousands of sweatshops. Why not target them? But I suppose because it's very forthcoming. It kind of presents you. But I decided to ignore performance art because it does get a little bit edgy. But essentially, there is in Vienna there was a kind of performance art resurgence, and there's one that particularly says in mind. It's horrific. But essentially, it's a kind of modern day vapid art. They're kind of ripping up their animals and making it. It's quite horrible. So if that's what you mean, but essentially that is a manifestation of the kind of breaking down of moral systems into a kind of Dionysiac cult. If that's But do you see what I mean? Kind of targeting.
We'll have this discussion.
One or two more questions.
Okay, Leo.
I wanted to say more for Luke's question. It's quite vague. I was wondering what you think of our fantasy and, recently with the Royal of Justice, arguably that's quite much a political piece of artwork. So how do you think he impacts the art scene?
Well, Banksy interests me purely because of the status of the artist, and he kind of builds on what Basquiat started. He is now, the ontological status of the artist is now that of a criminal. who runs around the city masked. But the actual semiotics he uses there essentially just kitsch. I think there's not much to them, and I don't think they have a kind of essentially stir up the people that it's going to stir up. I don't think it's going to enact political change. If you see what I mean, like I know it's quite cynical, and I don't think it's going to break people's heart. I think Banksy is kind of interesting, but you know.
You mentioned in the talk, like when people start using form, they have a chance to get more information more than the reality again. They start a new bubble. In your point of view, how will this bubble affect their view of reality?
So I think what I mentioned Peter Sloterdijk, and I'm sorry if I explained it really badly. Basically, he sees the Christian macrosphere as everything is organised within this kind of globe. So everything is organised within that globe, and then with the bourgeois patrons, things and the rise of the middle class, things start to kind of bubble. You see urbanisation begins to create bubbles in societies. But then he uses foam as the analogy of modernity, because everyone is kind of in their distinct bubble with their own set of influences, with their own ideas, with their own perception of what everything else is going on outside. And that is kind of what I was saying about Joseph Beuys's isolating principle. Everything exists in their kind of own little bubble in a kind of wide array of foam. And I think there will be a kind of event that bursts all these bubbles and kind of recreates a kind of macrosphere.
One more question. Paul, quickly for Ruth.
Okay, so your talk was like mostly centered on the West, which is like makes sense. But I wanted to ask, particularly towards the end of the 20th century, how much you think like multiculturalism and globalization has affected the like descent of like the dematerialism of art, like and how like this progression that you showed in so many different artists like has been affected by like interactions with non-Western cultures.
So the other cultures, Spengler sees it, that are present today are essentially petrified trees, which means that they are a tree that all the material within them has been replaced by sediment and stuff, and so they are no longer a living thing. Such as kind of the Meiji epoch is the kind of Jewish and Muslim age, and he sees that as a kind of petrified tree where the meaning systems essentially have dissolved, but there is a kind of an attempt to preserve them there. And so I don't think I think globalization is more a symptom of the West's kind of constant need for advancement. That's a kind of new phenomenon, which I think is quite interesting. But I think that is just symptomatic of the West. I don't think it has impacted the West as much as people would say, because essentially everything becomes a kind of superfluous state to the West. It's essentially an engulfing process. It's not like, but I'm not sure. We'll talk later if that was a terrible answer.
Ruth, I want to thank you on behalf of the audience for quite an extraordinary performance. I mean, the range of ideas, the range of art, the range of references. And you know, to have somebody your age talking to you about Spangler, Heidegger, Eliot, Joyce, these concepts, you know, a liquid modernity, the way in which the scrap heap of antiquity sit side by side with the scrap heap of modernity, is really amazing. Somebody asked about AI, but this is why we don't need AI, because we have Ruth Milborn. And I think if you take on these habits of reading, observing, collecting references, reflecting, relating to them, you're really going to come out a bit better than AI. But if you can please join me, and thank you, Ruth, thank you for your excellent questions.
Reading is the most important thing that you can do. Really more important than going to school, because you can because you get like everything I've learned about philosophy and art history and all this kind of stuff has come from reading. Reading is just so it's like intent. If you can read, you have to. I think Luder Quiana said that as he wrote his autobiography. He was a freed slave, and he kind of said that writing has the power to power beyond even imagine. I mean, it's just read.
Bag of cash is in your study literature. Thank you.
I am happy to answer more questions if you want to hang around, but feel free to leave. Thank you very much.
Makes so much sense.
For instance, there is like the chess, there is no conception, not metaphysical, but conceptually there is nothing that separates it from us. I think the presence of an idea and its specific Yes, I wanted to talk about music. I wish I was asking about music. Yeah. I think I'm quite interested in the guy Kaiji Pine. Yeah. Sorry,
No, just the parallel, the contrast between so in early 20th century music. I know
yes, I am listening to
the Untitled Cowboy.
Oh yeah.
That reminded me of the basically starting the Americana concept with the ballet Billy the Kid, and you get that contrast against the complete atonality that you find in sort of spectralism and serialism in Western Europe after Great Wars.
Well, I think that's interesting. I think I'm a little too like Freud, probably.
Yeah.
But I think it's mirrored in the architecture. This is, I can't quite remember what it's called, but essentially in modernist architecture, in the music, for example, like Schoenberg, you see the floating plate, everything is kind of disconnected, and you see this reflected in modern architecture. For instance, everything is very clean. I'll just put it
So basically, these eye idols, right?
Yeah.
They're like little alabaster Freddos, and I love them dearly. So they're found they're like almost exclusively in Tel Brak, which is like one city. People believe it was a big city, and especially in one temple, right?
Yeah.
And we're not quite sure who the temple is for. We do know that in Mesopotamia, big eyes, they're like indicative of religious observance.
Yeah.
So, we find them everywhere, and we find all these different kinds. Like we have ones with little kids, one that have two heads, so it's like a piggyback. We have families, we have couples.
4 eyes there.
Yeah, we have all kinds of things. But like some of them have cats, like maybe sacred mitres, that kind of thing, and no one's really worked out what they're for. And so, from what I've read around, they're sort of like for a very poor society that can't afford to like kill a bull, say for a sacrifice. They make a little one of these to do their offering as a kind of like as like a really like cheapskate votive. And I was wondering if like if art can still have such like meaning like that, because I know they count as art. They have like such meaning at that, but also being like practical and shaped by its environment as well as like the intention with which it was made.
Yeah. Well, I think what I would say initially about them, knowing not enough context to really make judgments, but essentially what I see here is the motif of the eyes always signifies a kind of religious devotion.
Yeah.
So by kind of carrying them around, they would be having a kind of religious devotion. And you said they were too poor to sacrifice. That certainly suggests that they were supplementing the kind of lack of sacrifice with the kind of motif of a kind of religious watcher who could then protects them and looks over them. But as for, what was your question? Sorry.
So it's just oh God, I'm sorry, I'm really.
We'll talk about it another time. Send me some articles and I'll read about it.
I will, yeah, if I can find them.
Good, if people just all thank you so much, Gavin.
Thank you, guys. We'll go to. I sent you an email, but you didn't see it.
Oh no, I have seen it.
Oh.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, I can do like.